If you're giving a presentation for a class this semester, chances are it will be virtual. That may mean that you record your presentation, upload it, and then submit it, or it may mean that you're presenting it live using a technology like Zoom. Now, as you can see on the screen, Zoom can be used for one person to record themselves, two people to have a conversation, a small group to interact, an entire class to collaborate, or those overwhelming meetings. The idea here is that even with this new technology, some things remain the same. However, there are some important differences between virtual presentations and traditional presentations that you should understand. Hi, this will be a discussion of virtual presentations and you. I'm Dr. Carl Brown. I am the Executive Director of the GV Speech Lab. Now, when you think of virtual presentations, you may think that this is a relatively new technology, and you would be wrong. In 1956, we had the very first telephone call that would have a video element. Telecommunications dates back over 60, 70 years ago. In fact, in 1964, it grew in popularity to the point that most major airports had video chat booths in them. The problem was, who were you going to call? Most houses did not have a video chat ability. This really caught on with those in positions of power. Politicians, world leaders used this to interact with one another. They thought this would replace meetings as we know it, sort of like we are doing now in replacing our in-person meetings due to the pandemic. These leaders quickly learned that it wasn't always a good idea to show your face when you were negotiating. Apparently, some of our leaders had tails. Now, while we have made advances from these days, we don't have a telephone in our hands with a rotary dial on it, we aren't quite to the future yet. We're not able to do a hologram presentation, which would be really extremely cool if we could do that. I know that some musicians that have passed on have been able to be recreated in hologram form, but we're still waiting for a class presentation to use this technology. Instead, we're somewhere between the old and the future. We're in the present. And this is what it looks like. You're all familiar with that. But even though we're using this very frequently, that doesn't mean that we're using it correctly. Let's make sure we are. To do that, we're going to cover 4 basic topics. First of all, don't drop the basic elements of a good presentation. Second, we'll talk about the importance of considering the visual environment when you are speaking virtually. Third, we'll talk about the nonverbal considerations that you will need to make. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about hardware and software that you might use to give your presentation. So to begin, don't drop the basics. While there are many differences between the two styles of speaking, virtual and face-to-face, there are more similarities. For example, you should still connect with your audience through a well thought out and constructed speech. You'll want to include things like a catchy attention getter to hook the audience early, clear organization and structure of main points so that it's easy to follow. Just like in an in-person presentation, you'll want to focus on clarity with an online presentation. The important part is that your audience is able to understand your message, so you need to understand what that message is as well. Ask yourself key questions. What does my audience need to know? What can they not know? What do they already know? That will depend on who your audience is, of course, and just like in a traditional presentation setting, you'll want to be able to answer those questions before you ever start your actual presentation. Similarly, make sure that you're considering your impression management. In other words, what will the audience think when they see you on the screen? Just like you would consider what the audience may think when they see you in front of a room, do the same with this technology. First of all, stand up to give your presentation. Now, if you're unable to do that for a physical reason, this doesn't apply. And if you're not expected to stand up, maybe for a conference style presentation, a round table discussion, or a boardroom discussion, those may be exceptions to this standing rule. However, what's not an exception is to dress appropriately. This does not mean that you need to dress in a suit, whether you're a man or a woman. It just means fit the expectations of the audience. Also, even though you're not in person, prepare yourself for some small talk that may come from the audience, and prepare yourself for a question and answer period that's likely to follow your presentation. So, we've talked a little bit about some of the similarities and differences between traditional and virtual presentations. Let's focus in on one of those. The first is visual environment and how important it is to understand what is going on around you when you are giving a virtual presentation. The image on the screen is a screenshot from the BBC World News. Now, the gentleman on the screen, I do not know who he is, but I can tell you that he did not pay very close attention to what was behind him before he decided to go live on the air. Look from left to right. You'll see that, one, the window blinds are halfway up or a quarter of the way up, and they are uneven. You'll see that there are pillows in the floor. There is a nightstand that appears to have the doors open as though someone has rifled through there. You've got what looks to be a bed directly behind him that's somewhat made. You've got at least part of a chair beside the bed that has something over the top of it, maybe a coat. And then you've got a chest of drawers that has some items on the top, and the bottom drawer isn't completely closed. Now, this gentleman may be an expert. He may be wearing a suit and tie, but his credibility suffers when this is his background. So be mindful of what's happening behind you. Similarly, our friend in this picture has some growth happening. That may be the newest hairstyle, or it could be a plant in the room. It's kind of hard to tell, but I'm hoping it's a plant. Now, when you're thinking about your background, also think about, is there something in motion or is it stable? On many newscasts, you will see airplanes in the sky moving behind the speakers, the anchors. This is done through using a live video feed behind them. They, however, have professional technicians who make this happen and make it appear to look so thorough and clean that sometimes we can't tell what's real and what's a video. We don't need to consider all of those elements when we are giving a presentation. Go ahead and make your background stable. Avoid outdoor recording in general. There are too many variables that may happen. We'll come back to this in a moment, but avoid windows simply because things move outside of the windows. It could be a distraction to your audience, or it could cause some problem with your recording. The best bet is to use a clean board or wall as your background. That doesn't mean a plain white wall all the time. You may have a clock or a plant that's appropriately placed, unlike our friend on the screen, but something that is not distracting and that is clear for your audience to focus on you and not what's happening behind you. Speaking of distracting the audience, the lighting that you use should be carefully considered so that the audience isn't consumed with wondering why you made the lighting choices that you did. First of all, your lighting should be reasonably bright. If you're recording indoors, as I hope you are, and you're staying away from those windows to avoid being distracted, turn the lights on in the room that you're using. Turn all of them on if possible. Again, avoid windows, not for the distraction element this time, but because, as you can see in these images, when it's bright behind you from a window, it becomes dark on your face. However, when the window is in front of you, the light hits your face and it brightens it up. If you're recording inside and it's at all possible, use daylight bulbs in your fixtures. That will give you a cleaner light that will bring out the room and you, the speaker, in the visual field of your audience. What about framing? How will you look in the square or rectangle that the audience sees? I want to give you the advice of finding the Goldilocks zones. That means it's just right. It's not too much, it's not too little. This can be applied to a variety of elements when it comes to framing. First of all, balance what we'll call white or blank space. The area around you that's not you should be balanced on either side and top to bottom as much as possible. Also, work the angles. Our friend in the image here is not using an effective angle. This is what I call the up your nose angle, where we are below the speaker looking up at him or her. Use something to prop your computer or recording device up on if you're sitting at a table. Right now, when I make these videos, I am using a shoebox and it brings it just to the right level. Preview any out of frame movements that you may use. As a speaker, when you move from side to side or across a room, we can watch you and see that full field of vision. However, when we're watching on a virtual platform, we only see what the camera allows us to see. And if you leave that box, that can be distracting. So if you need to go get a pen or something similar, let us know that you're leaving and that you will be back. Generally speaking, natural shifts are fine. If you need to adjust the way you're sitting or straighten your shirt, feel free to do those things. However, avoid repeated movements and constant motions. So if you are someone who sways when you speak, you'll really want to work on fixing that. If you sort of touch your clothes or your face or your hair when you speak, be aware of that as well. Those motions will be magnified by the element of virtual communication. It will stand out to your audience as it may not in a live setting. What about how close you get to the screen? I think our friend does a pretty good job with staying a Goldilocks zone distance away from the camera, but maybe not Leo. This is the ideal dimensions for your screen. If you want to think of your camera angle, the box that you appear in these different zones, you'll want to balance what's full and what's not. Try this with your presentation, and I think you'll see that you will be able to make yourself look more professional. So, now that we've talked about the differences and similarities between traditional and virtual speaking, as well as some of the visual elements and environment elements to be aware of, let's discuss nonverbal considerations that are especially important when you're using virtual communication. When you're in a traditional setting, we see all of you. However, when you are in a virtual setting, we are likely to mainly see your face. Now, your face can tell us a lot about your emotional state. However, it can easily be misinterpreted. So, as you see in the text, there could be an RBF face, a resting face that looks unapproachable, unhappy. Our friends in the images have RBF. If that's you, it's understandable. However, when presenting virtually, make sure that you are smiling or making an appropriate facial expression so that the audience doesn't misread your face as annoyance or anger. We could also consider the WTF face, or a confused look. Some folks have a confused look when they are focused, when they are really paying attention and in the zone. And if that's you as a speaker, as you get into your material, make sure that you're practicing, again, not appearing to be confused. The idea here is that the look on your face can tell the audience something inaccurate about you that may hurt your credibility or their ability to connect with you. Our facial expressions are sometimes known as emotional readouts, and if that is the case, there's where the confusion comes in. Also, be aware of micro expressions. We all do some form of micro expression from time to time, and you can't get rid of them completely. But be aware of your face, practice being in control of those muscles, and really remember that the face is the focus on virtual communication. Arguably, the most important element of your face when speaking is your eye contact. For virtual speaking, remember that eye contact is camera contact. You will look at the camera, wherever that is for you, and that will be the way that eye contact is perceived by the audience. There will continue to be an expectation of eye contact with virtual speaking, just as there is with traditional speaking. However, some differences. One would be, don't scan the room. If you were speaking in a traditional setting, say a classroom, I would give you the advice to scan the room. Make sure that you look at as many people in that room as you possibly can. At least divide the room into thirds and go from section to section. But with virtual speaking and everyone watching the same screen or their own unique screen, it will appear as though you're making direct eye contact with them if you look at your camera. What some folks do, and I consider it a mistake, is to use a news interview form of eye contact. If you've ever been interviewed by the news, you know that they tell you not to look at the camera. They want you to look at the reporter. And that gives the back and forth that really is an interview. It shows that there is more than one person speaking. However, a presentation is not an interview. A presentation is an interaction between a speaker and an audience. And since that audience is only visible to you through your camera, make sure you're looking at it. What can sidetrack this is inappropriate use of notes. It's still a good idea to use notes as you present virtually. However, place them in a spot that it's not far from your camera. You could type them on the screen and keep them toward the top if your camera is at the top of your screen, as it is in many laptops. Maybe you want to use paper. You could tape that to a screen or a shelf behind your computer or webcam so that you can move your eyes very slightly to pick up your notes and then go right back to your camera. What you don't want to do is have the camera in one place and your notes in another. And then you have to shift between two different locations with your eyes. For the audience, this will be distracting and it could take away from your credibility. So the audience wants to make eye contact with you. Make that expectation happen for them. In traditional speeches, gestures are vital, and while they may not be as vital in a virtual setting, they're still important. Why? Because gestures aid understanding. When we count to 4, we usually use our fingers to do that if we're interacting. If we give someone directions, we use our hands to show left and right turns. Gestures help us understand messages, and they need to be included in virtual presentations. But be extra careful to be purposeful with your gestures. For example, if you want to show us something that's small, put your hands close together. If you want to show growth, slowly move them apart. If you want to show large, hold them far apart. Now, you also want to be correct with what you're doing in terms of your gestures. So, if you're talking about something to the left or to the right, and you gesture left or right, in a traditional setting, you want to do the opposite because your left is the audience's right and vice versa. However, depending on your camera settings, that may get flipped again as you deliver virtually. So practice understanding if the left is really the left for the audience. Again, it doesn't much matter if it's your left and if it's correct to you, but will it be correct to the audience? The last thing with gestures is make sure they're visible. Some individuals who speak virtually give gestures. They use good gestures, but it's hard to see them because they're holding them below the framing of the camera. I don't want you to be a Ricky Bobby and hold your hands in front of your face. If you've not seen that movie, you don't get the reference, but if you have, I think you do. In other words, make sure that we can see your hands without giving us sort of an interpretive dance approach to presenting. The key thing with gestures, practice them. Don't assume they'll come naturally as you present, as you may rely on that with a traditional presentation. As you speak, you'll want to use a moderate pace. That's something that's the same with a traditional and virtual presentation. However, in a traditional setting, if the pace is a little too quick, the pronunciation is slightly off, the enunciation is a little muddled, sometimes we can still make sense of what you are saying. However, that becomes more difficult with a virtual presentation. It's very important that you use that moderate pace, that you're using the correct pronunciation. I realize that people say different words in different ways, the old tomato example. However, if it's a particular word that's only said one way, make sure that you know how to say it. Go to dictionary.com, let them say it for you, and then model your pronunciation from theirs. Understand that enunciation is crucial. You need to be understandable so that the audience can follow along with what you're saying and connect with you. Check on yourself by recording during practice. See if someone is able to understand what you're saying. Of course, you will know what you're saying, so maybe bring in an outside person. The Grand Valley Speech Lab is a great place to come and make sure that you're being understood. Last, if there are tricky words in your presentation that may end up with a tongue-tied moment, practice those words too. If you find yourself delivering a tricky word and it comes out in a bit of a tongue-tied mess, try to correct it once and then simply move on. There's no need to apologize, and we'll figure out what you meant. Last in this section, remember that volume matters. This is the same in a traditional speech as it is virtually. However, it's more important in a virtual setting. So, test yourself. Test your software. How loud are you? Are you screaming? Please don't. Speak loud enough so that the microphone can pick you up. Where is your microphone? Where is it located on your recording device? Make sure it's not covered up and that something's laying over it or rubbing against it. That can cause a very distracting moment in your presentation. Finally, don't drop volume at the end of sentences. I did it there as an example, but we can tell when people drop the volume at the end of a sentence, it becomes difficult to understand what they're saying. The small chart there on the right of this graph shows you that some folks like to go up in volume and pitch at the end. Some go down in volume and pitch. If you can keep it somewhere in the middle, like that green arrow pointing to the red line, that's all we ask to make an effective vocal delivery. So now, we know some of the similarities and differences. We know some of the verbal and nonverbal elements as well as the visual environment. Let's finish up by talking about hardware and software that you will use. It's no surprise that there is a plethora of options when it comes to your chosen means of virtual presentations. I've mentioned Zoom and Google Meet. There are countless others, probably at least 5 to 10 that are very popular in this era of the pandemic. No matter what you're using, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first two are to know where the camera and the microphone are located on your hardware. When it comes to software, regardless of what that is, play with it. Make practice fun. Talk with a friend. Record yourself. See what backgrounds are available. This can give you an advantage when it comes time to make an actual presentation because you're familiar with what your technology will and will not do. Remember that as you speak, in terms of technology, competence is credibility. If there is an ongoing error because you didn't realize how to use the technology effectively, that can hurt your credibility as a speaker, and you want to make sure that you maintain as much credibility as possible. Related to that, always have a backup plan. What if the technology that you're using fails while you're speaking? What if it fails before you ever start to speak on the day of the presentation? Are you using Zoom? Did Zoom crash? Can you use another program? What about Google Meet? What about Skype? Again, there are plenty of other options, but have a backup plan just in case yours doesn't work on the day of the presentation. So today, we talked about the importance of not dropping the basic elements of any good presentation. We talked about the importance of the visual environment and what's behind you. We talked about nonverbal considerations that really rolled over into verbal ones. And we discussed the importance of understanding your hardware and your software. While it's true, we're not to the level of Han Solo looking at a nice hologram as we give presentations. It's also important to remember that we're not stuck back when we had a rotary phone and a small television, it looks like, in order to interact virtually. Now we have a lot of options in terms of technology that make the experience much more user-friendly. Speaking of making your experience more user-friendly, be sure to visit the Grand Valley Speech Lab, where we have virtual appointments available by going to our website, gvsu.edu/speechlab. And we can help you take your presentation, whether that's in person or virtual, to the next level.